Susan, first of all, I have to congratulate you on an incredible movie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It pretty much encapsulates everything that's of interest to me personally. Architecture, for one, urban renewal, for another, and opera, for a third. I actually worked for Sarah Caldwell at the Opera Company of Boston for several years and experienced a lot of the kind of backstage stuff that you showed in your movie. And what strikes me about the structure of this film is that it's almost the same kind of beautiful tapestry that opera requires, that also is what required to make this whole enterprise happen. It's like so many different levels. You managed to stitch in everything from the artistic endeavors to the urban renewal. You even got Robert Moses in there. And so my very first question is, why did you make this movie?
Well, actually, I've always feel like I've been very lucky with my career, you know. And I've made many, many films with Peter Gelb. In fact, I think this is like our 14th or 15th film. Way before he became general manager, we made a documentaries together. And we were having dinner one night, and he said, oh, it's, you know, coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Met being at Lincoln Center. And I said, well, what's, you know, we started talking about like why that was so interesting. And we realized that it really is a history kind of New York City in the 1950s. And it's really kind of like was the perfect storm between like politics and culture coming together to make it happen. And initially we thought one of the main story threads would be the whole displacement of the original community, of the Lincoln Square community, because even though this was Robert Moses's, you know, great idea that he was going to revitalize the Upper West Side, we were always told that this was a real slum. As we started to dig into the history, we realized it wasn't really a slum. It was certainly tenement buildings, but it was a vibrant community where 3 and 4 generations of families had lived there. And we had also been told that all of them had been moved to Co-op City, and that's what became Co-op City. That was another inaccurate. That was not accurate. So that kind of storyline went away. But then we realized, in a way, the history is an opera because it's got these wonderful characters, these larger-than-life characters. It's got Robert Moses. It's got the Rockefeller family, which we hardly even have in there at this point. And it had Rudolph Bing, who was this kind of legendary general manager who really did revitalize the kind of the opera productions, which in many ways is what Peter Gelb has been trying to do when he took over the general manager. So it's like 50 years later, Peter Gelb's trying to do the same thing. It seems like this is what art has to do. These great art firms, they have to revitalize themselves. They have to find some way to live in the modern, you know, to become more modernized. So there were so many different themes. It was kind of a hard film to make because just kind of getting it down to something that where we could tell a story. But what helped tremendously, 2 things. We knew that we had this great footage by Bob Drew, and I know there are a lot of documentary filmmakers here who know who Bob Drew is, but he really was really like the first pioneer of cinema verite in America, you know, and he's the one, all of the footage in the last third of the film, of them actually, it's like the 3 weeks before the Opera House opens, that's Bob Drew's footage. He made a film for Bell Telephone Hour following the month leading up to the opening in 1966. And so we had this footage that he had, and we saw kind of all the pitfalls that he had to go through to get the Opera House open. And we were hoping we could get Leontine Price. And Leontine Price retired in like 85, 86, and she really didn't do any interviews. She very much felt like when you retire, you leave the stage. And she didn't do anything in public. And Peter Gelb wrote her a beautiful letter, and then I wrote her what we were going to kind of we wanted to talk about. And she agreed because this was her operatic home. Yeah. And I went down with a very good friend of mine, Muffy Meyer, who was helping me produce at the time this film. And we just had a conversation with Leontine, and as you can see, she's quite a storyteller, and she was kind of like the spark plug that keeps the film moving.
Well, you have very many narrative arcs to this movie, and that again kind of refers back to the structure of opera to begin with. You know, it's like you have the overtures, and then you have the swelling dramatic arcs, and then you have the places where it quiets down a little bit, and then you have more dramatic arcs. And I don't know, it seemed to me to be a kind of a beautiful coming together of all of the different ways that you could talk about these kinds of things. And there are so many different aspects of what goes into this kind of endeavor in terms of the making of an opera house. First of all, is involved by, as I have been in the opera, I actually never even thought about what the Metropolitan Opera was, where it was, or what it was like before it went to Lincoln Center. And that whole, beginning of, what it was before it is what it is now is probably quite a surprise to a lot of people.
Well, it's a fascinating history, actually. And what was really interesting, which we couldn't, there are so many, the history was so complex that we couldn't tell it all, but certainly the opera house, the old opera house, when it was built in 1883, and it was on between 7th and 8th Avenue on 40th Street, it was built by the nouveau riche. It was built by the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts because they could not get boxes in the original opera house, which was the Academy of Music. Mm-hmm. And that's where the real money was. And so these people built their own opera house. And basically, they made it all boxes. It was just all to see and be seen. And it was the Diamond Horseshoe. That's what its nickname was. And it was really, there was, just like you learned in the film, there was absolutely nothing backstage to be able to put on an opera. You had to use 7th Avenue as your storage area.
That was an amazing part of this documentary is actually realizing what was happening in the back of the house, and they were storing their scenery and everything outside
in the snow.
In the snow, and you think about how many hundreds of thousands of dollars have been sunk into these sets that they're building, that they're out there.
And it's all being supported at that time by private money, all by the box holders, so to speak. And this was considered like the golden age of opera, too, some of the greatest singers, and they were, and so that's why, so really as early as 1908, they were starting to realize they had to find a new place. But as you can see, it took 50 years before it all came together.
So what was your biggest surprise in doing the film?
I think the biggest surprise for all of us was the story of how the chandeliers were designed, because we had always heard that it was the chandeliers were made by Lobmeyer in Austria, and in fact, if you go to the gift shop, you can buy like a small rendering, or I think you can actually buy a small model of one, and it says Lobmeyer of Austria designed them, and then we kept trying to find, the way we found that story is we were trying to find anyone who was still alive who had worked with Wallace K. Harrison, the architect. We wanted, that was another kind of operatic thing, not to digress too much, but the fact that he had been designing opera's house, really he was very involved with the initial design at Rockefeller Center of the Met Opera in 1925, 26, and he had always been, as a hobby, designing opera houses. And then the fact that he didn't get to design the opera house that he had dreamt about and had been designing half of his life. We liked that narrative arc to some degree, and the infighting, and the fact that he and, Philip Johnson, who we all revere, and we all know his name, and nobody knows Harrison's name, but But anyway, in the search for anyone who had worked with Harrison that was still alive, we came across Kina Lesky, who we interviewed in the film, the daughter of Tad Lesky. And she had written an essay about the genesis of ideas. She's an architect herself. She teaches at RISD in Providence, Rhode Island. And when we read her essay about the genesis of ideas, and part of the idea of this, she calls it like the explosive geometry, but it really had to do with the Big Bang, because the Big Bang was also, you know, a concept that was coming alive at the same time. And so that was one of the things that her father was very interested in, as was Wallace Harrison. So we read this essay, and then we started talking to her, and we realized this whole idea that everything started from an accident. And we love that idea. And I think that sequence in the film is so much about how you create. It's such a hard thing. How do you create? You know, you rarely get to see it, but somehow she's able to articulate it. We felt, you know.
Oh, I think one of the beauties of documentary film is something that's very dear to the heart of me, and it's one of the core values of the Parrish Art Museum is this idea of illuminating the creative process. And I think what you've done, you know, quite deftly here is delving into all of those various areas that take place, the accident, the control, showing Zeffirelli and how he coped. That must have been, you know, quite interesting also to realize, you know, if you talk about accident and control, it's like, okay, so if you have to restage an entire section of the opera because the stage doesn't move around anymore, you know, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and how you adapt to those kinds of things.
Absolutely. I think our biggest regret is that we weren't able to film Zeffirelli. You know, when we started making this film, we started wondering, oh my gosh, you know, the main people who are going to speak and tell their stories are all over 90, you know, and it's amazing. I mean, Leotine's 90.
I was going to say, how old is she? She's 90?
She was 1 week before her 90th birthday when we filmed her.
Boy, I hope
she's
I'm
90.
like that when I'm 90.
I do too. The same eye makeup, she gets it on perfectly, and she's so young, and she's so, her memory is just extraordinary. She could remember, I mean, like the story of going into Bing's office when they asked her to open, she remembers so many details of it. It's just wonderful, you know. And then Alou Bey, who in many ways misses the old opera house, you know, the one who dreams about it at night, he's 92. Herman Krawitz is 92. They hate each other. I wish we could have filmed them together, because
you could make a whole nother movie.
I know. Even now, they had to work together, and the idea that the lobby of the Met was sacrificed at the end for the backstage still upsets Alou Bey. And so we had these wonderful 90-year-olds, you know, telling this extraordinary story, and they were wonderful storytellers. But that's a risk, because you don't know what you're going to get.
Well, that's true. I mean, obviously you have a storyboard. You figure out who you can get, who's going to say what, or you think, and then then it's accident, right? Because you don't know what anybody is going to remember or how they're going to be on film or anything. Absolutely,
absolutely. But I always depend on luck. I always depend on luck, and we got very lucky with the people that we filmed. And even Victoria Newhouse, who was the only person who's written really a book on the architect, and she's Cy Newhouse's wife, and he was very sick, and so it was very hard to even get an interview with her, and we only had a very short amount of time, but she just let it loose, you know. She just told the story the way she remembered it, and it was quite kind of like emotional. So we enjoyed that too.
So to end up with a film that's an hour and 45 minutes long, could you make a whole nother film out of all the things that are left over that you didn't use?
No, we couldn't. No, we couldn't do that. No, I don't think so. But certainly, I mean, we had a lot of material about the way the Rockefellers and the kind of New York City power brokers at the time, their whole concept of what, you know, this idea that they were going to fight the Cold War by making New York City the capital of the world, you know, because Berlin was destroyed. This is post World War II. Berlin's destroyed, London to some degree is destroyed, Paris. They felt like this was an opportunity to really bring New York into becoming the cultural capital of the world, and then all of a sudden America had all this leisure time, and what was the best way for Americans to spend leisure time? It was high culture. I mean, there was a whole concept of the Cold War and what's the best. All of that just went by the wayside. So that we could But we found that what really made the most, as always, is the personal stories.
Yeah.
And to tell the history through people and their own memories. Because I feel like the film, aside from being about the creative process, is also about memory and sense of place and how kind of certain art forms can really sustain you throughout your life. And I felt that resonated very strongly with me, and that's what I'm hoping this film will do.
Well, you know, it's also interesting. There is a lot of time spent, a little bit of time spent about, you know, not the people that are in the diamond circle, but the people that are standing online waiting, and the woman who said that she's been coming to the Met for 40 years and she's really sorry that the old building is going away. Opera, I think, is thought of as being a very rarefied type of art form that is not available to most people. I do think that in this story arc that you were able to put forward, it does address the fact that, you know, there was an idea that was about urban renewal and about, you know, making the best opera house you could, but it was also about making something for the people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Even though what they do say about Lincoln Center is that in the end, you know, it's raised up on a platform, Lincoln Center, and you have to remember that when it was built in '66, that actually was parts of that area were slum area, and so they wanted to bring this to the people, but they also wanted to kind of keep it elite as well. I mean, that's always the controversy about. If you look at, you know, on Amsterdam Avenue, there's the right behind Lincoln Center are the Amsterdam Houses, which were one of the very first public housing projects in New York. And there's no way they could get easily into Lincoln Center. There are big walls, they call them the Chinese walls there, and you see them today, you know, and that was to keep that element out. That element out. But the thing is that, you know, the family circle in the balcony is where the you know, the hoi polloi, so to speak, or, you know, the common man can go and afford opera, and those are always sold out. Yep. You know, and that's, as Alube says, that's where he learned about opera, talking to those people.
Were you an opera fan before you started this project?
Well, you know, I like many people. I was intimidated by opera, but I have made many films now with Peter Gelb on opera. So yes, now I am a big opera fan. I try to go to the opera as often as I can.
And do you stay in the dress circle, or?
I want to sit in Peter's box if I can. I want to sit with Peter. But I will say this: my editor, Peter Livingston, who I think did such a beautiful job. When we first started, we said we want to use opera as the soundtrack. And he's like in a rock band, you know. I mean, he didn't know much about opera. And I said to him, well, you know, there's the great opening of Valkyrie, that's a great overture, and there's the overture to La Traviata and to Madame Butterfly. And I knew some of these. I'm like a dilettante in a way. But we really kind of studied it, and he would go home every night, and I think he stayed up to like 3 every morning and just listened to opera. And we thought that making the whole soundtrack out of opera, you know, instrumental parts of opera that are so beautiful. There's a lot of Wagner, and we know that Wagner really was kind of people think of him as like the grandfather of the movie scores, you know, Hollywood movie scores. So there's a tremendous amount of Wagner and Puccini and Faust. I mean, Strauss, oddly enough, in here.
No Mozart.
Only the opening. The very opening is Magic Flute. Yeah. Right.
Let's open it up, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Yeah.
How much consideration did you give to exploring the future of places like this and the future of opera with the advent of everything from opera at the movies to information technology? Did
everybody hear the question? Okay, good. Go ahead.
Well, actually, we kept it more, we didn't really give too much consideration to that, I'm sorry to say, because we felt like the story really was talking about how the history of the Metropolitan Opera getting to Lincoln Center, and then we had that footage of leading up to opening night, and so we thought that would be the parameters of the film. But I think this is actually going to be playing, you know, the Met has those wonderful HD broadcasts. And this will, January 13th, this is going to be part of one of those. They're going to do a special screening on January 13th. So, but I think that, I mean, I have to applaud Peter Gelb in starting that initiative and bringing opera to so many places in the United States that don't get an opportunity to really, get to see this art form live.
Audience for you.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think about the high-definition broadcast these days?
The question is, what does she think about the high-def broadcasts of opera now?
I actually love them. I find myself going to them. I find myself, they always broadcast a few months later on PBS, and I watch almost all of them. I think it's a great way to get into becoming familiar with operas that you might not have, certainly that I don't know. The productions are stunning. I mean, we edited the film up at the Opera House, just in a tiny little room, but we see how much effort goes into these HD broadcasts. They're beautifully produced. I mean, they have wonderful directors that they bring in, and, you know, they have like 14 cameras shooting them. I mean, it's really a tremendous amount of effort goes into making them. So I think they're beautifully produced, and I like them. There is, some people say, I've heard, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but that many people don't go to the opera anymore because they can go to watch it in the movie theaters, you know, and that kind of hurts on the revenue. But on the other hand, I think it's bringing this art form. I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, which we used to have to go up to Atlanta to see the opera, like when the Met would come through Atlanta. And now you can just go to one of the big movie theaters and see opera, you know, pretty regularly. So I think that's wonderful.
I have to interject myself into this conversation because as the director of an art museum, I'm very much of two minds about this kind of thing. I understand everything that you've said about it, and certainly there is, opera is not super available to many people. As you say, you grew up in Tallahassee, you had to drive all the way to Atlanta to go and have an authentic experience of opera. So I do think that there's value, a lot of value, to having these HD productions so that you can, broaden your audience and have people have an experience about, going to an opera or hearing the music. But it does not take the place
No, you're right.
of the authentic experience. And it's actually quite sad to hear that some people will say, well, I don't really have to bother to go to the actual production because I can just watch it on television, which in a certain way is almost the same thing as saying, I don't need to see the painting in real life because I can always get a JPEG of it and look at it on my computer. So these kinds of ways of experiencing performative experiences in culture, whether it's an actual performance or looking at an authentic work of art, it's very complicated because, yes, you want to build audiences and you want people to be able to have access to this kind of information and experience. But somehow people have to understand that it is not the same. And in your
I actually agree.
Yeah, and in the conversations with Leoton Price, for example, you do get the understanding that you can watch this on the film and have a kind of an uplifting feeling about what it was like for her, but it is nothing like what it would be like if you were actually in the room when she's talking about how she opened her mouth for the very first time and, oh my God, my own voice is broadcasting out into this enormous hall, and what an incredible experience that was. If you don't have the opportunity to see that in real life, it's very
I tend to agree too. And some nights when you go to the opera or the ballet, and there's a sense of excitement in the air when you walk in. There's just nothing like it, And then you see this phenomenal performance, or going to Carnegie Hall, the same thing, and hearing an orchestra perform. I do agree 100% on that.
It's hard because you want everyone to have the opportunity to have an experience, but you want to make sure that people have an opportunity to have the lived experience, which is nice that we're sitting in a theater where they do this all the time. One more question maybe before everybody decides to go home? Yeah, right here.
Did a great job, Susan. I'm an opera fan, and you
Wonderful.
really knocked it out of the park. The thing that got me was a few things, but in watching the demolition of that beautiful old neighborhood of tenements, I kept thinking about the fact that at the same time that was happening, on another art form, the art form of the motion picture, an American opera was being photographed there, West Side Story, and it kind of solidified that point in time forever. And it was like a beautiful bridge between that old neighborhood with the art form of the opera, the new opera being the musical, and the whole scene. And it kind of bred for a lovely tie-in that you had in that whole thing, and the melancholy that they have of the old neighborhood lives on in another art form and forever. But and aside to I watch the opera at Lincoln Center, of course, but here in town, when available, I go to Guildhall, and for a few bucks, with an audience, with the audience reaction, full glory of high definition, and for people who don't speak the language, there's subtitles too, and the crowd is electric, and it's a wonderful way to experience it. So you get what you want and what we want to avoid going into Manhattan and paying, the exorbitant prices of parking and all the other stuff, and to pay for the opera is another thing. And it also subsidizes the opera. These high definition things across the world subsidize an art form that you couldn't charge enough to pay for what it is. And again, I thank you for a beautiful job. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your patience and your attendance.